Hey everyone, and welcome to the first ever episode of my new series called The Basement Blather, which is basically just me blathering on about certain items and how good they are, where I think their niches are and lie, what their strengths and weaknesses are. It's just an item discussion video where I give my thoughts on items that I think the community might appreciate, items that are heavily discussed for whichever reason, whether they are weak, strong, and all that stuff. You know, there's a bunch of controversial or at least much talked about items in the Binding of Isaac, and I thought, you know, what better item to start off this series with than my personal favorite, the really knife. Quick though, before we start off with this, make sure to sub to the channel. I would really appreciate it. I'm trying to hit my goal of 2,500 subs before the end of the year, and I'm currently 4 away as of the making of this video, so please, if you enjoy this kind of content, leave a like, leave a sub, and let me know in the comments which items you want me to discuss in the future. Mom's knife, you know, in my opinion, as you know if you watch my videos, the strongest item in the game. And that's it for this talk. Thank you for... No. It's incredibly strong. I really think there is no doubt about it. I mean, a few months back, earlier in 2023, I made a tier list ranking every single item in the game. And to no one's surprise, I ranked Mom's Knife as the strongest item in the game. I also have a challenge where I proved it by beating the game with only Mom's Knife. All these videos are going to be linked in the video description if you want to check them out later. They're readily available, and I think they're also really interesting to see. But yeah, Mom's Knife, I mean, it's really strong. It has a lot of upsides and very few downsides that I want to go into as well. It is, in my opinion, the only item that is able to beat the game just on its own. Maybe not the harder bosses. I mean, I could see myself beating pretty much every boss with this item except maybe Hush and Delirium, you know, speaking only Mom's Knife and nothing else. And it can do so many things to you, right? Like, it's a melee weapon that you can stick, you know, you can point at an enemy that chases you, and you can just let the enemy run into it and it's gonna die. It's a long-range weapon that you throw and you deal just ridiculous amounts of damage. I mean, we're in caves here right now, and we have 6.22 damage, which is already a lot for caves, but even with that, you can see how ridiculously fast Knife clears all these rooms and how well it does, right? And this is just the beginning of the run as well. And most of the time you find a Knife, you're also not going to find it with 3.5 damage, or at least you're not going to stay on 3.5 damage over the course of the entire run. But you're going to get more damage, and that way it just gets more and more ridiculous. I mean, it's not uncommon to have a Knife run and go to Blue Baby, or the Lamb, or any boss that doesn't have a boss shield, basically, and it's not uncommon to see them fall within the first 3 seconds of the fight starting. It's absolutely ridiculous how much damage it does. And at the same time, you know, it's not super easy to use. I'm not saying, you know, it's a difficult item to use and that you need to be super good with it, but the first few times you pick up Mom's Knife, it is gonna feel pretty awkward, right? Like, it's definitely very different from just firing tears. A lot of the time you just have to get close to enemies. And when you're close to them, there is a bigger chance of taking damage, right? And that's also, like, that ties in with what I personally think is Mom's Knife's biggest weakness, but again, more on that later. It's just a very strong item. It doesn't matter what part of the run you find it, it's just gonna massively improve your chances of winning. And once again, I would like to emphasize that I'm talking purely from a survival standpoint, right? I do a challenge called Eden Destination Roulette, trying to beat as many runs as possible with Eden while randomizing my goals, and I'm talking purely from a you know, survival standpoint. Of course, you know, I made the tier list back in the day and I posted it to Reddit, and a lot of people basically told me that I must really hate synergies if I love Mom's Knife so much, but that's not the point of that tier list, right? My tier list was ranking items based on how much more likely they make it for you to win the run, right? And in those terms, Mom's Knife definitely takes the cake. There's almost no situation in which you find Mom's Knife and taking it actually lowers your odds of winning the run. It's almost impossible for that to happen. If you just want to win the run, it's pretty much always required for you to pick it up. And, you know, I don't hate synergies, quite the contrary. If you've watched my videos, you've probably seen me skip over Mom's Knife multiple times. Because, yeah, I agree, it's a very bland item in terms of synergies. I mean, sure, you can find some stuff that works with it, like first and foremost, triple shot or quad shot 2020. Everything that gives you more knives, of course, is always fun. There's the infamous brim synergy, where you just fire a flurry of knives after throwing your knife, and that one is insanely fun. But for the most part, I mean, that's it. You have some items like number 1, which makes your knife yellow, which I personally always really like. It doesn't really change much about the knife. I mean, of course, it ups your charge rate for the knife, but it also lowers your range. Knife is affected by those stats. But for the most part, you know, it's still the same old knife. Sure, it's yellow, and I think that's flashy, personally. Like, I really love items that change the knife's color, or Brimstone's color for that matter, or the explosion color on Dr. Fetus. I think those are incredibly fun items, and it's just fun to see, you know, your item change appearance, even if the effect that you get with it doesn't necessarily do anything. That being said, talking about color changes, one color I don't actually see my knife take on is purple. I'm personally not a big fan of the knife with the homing combination. I think a lot of the time, so the way it works is if you throw the knife, it's gonna start homing in on the closest enemy to you. But most of the time when you enter a room, what you want to do is you just want to throw that knife straight into the middle of the room, right? Because a big percentage of rooms have an enemy right in the center. And if you have a room where there's enemies in the center, but there's also an enemy in the corner, the knife is usually going to try and arc towards the enemy in the corner. And since your knife is fully charged, it's not even going to hit that enemy. So you pretty much just waste your first knife throw a whole lot when you play it with the homing. That's just a personal preference, of course. Homing in a lot of scenarios makes it much easier to hit that knife, to hit those knife throws, but I also think a lot of the time it can just be detrimental. I don't like it personally. It's one of those things that I like to call uncomfortable, even though they are objectively good. Even though, admittedly, with Mom's knife, I'm not 100% sure if it's actually objectively good to have homing, but it has its moments. I wouldn't really say homing is like the biggest weakness of the knife, but it's something that you want to carefully consider when you come across it. Other than that, obviously, there's also always those rooms where enemies are behind large gaps, and if you got a bunch of range downs with your knife, then you might not be able to hit those. So I have seen people time out on rooms and have to wait it out because they couldn't reach enemies with knives. That's especially funny in a racing scenario. Although in a racing scenario, people would generally be, you know, vigilant not to fall below a certain range threshold. You also don't pop pills really in races, and in speedrunning, because you don't want to chance anything most of the time, so a range down can't really ruin your day. But it is kind of funny. I don't think this is actually a widely known fact, but yeah, if you get stuck in a room after like 2 minutes or so, the doors actually open, so you can't really be truly soft locked in that way, even if your knife can't reach something. But obviously there's more fun activities in The Binding of Isaac than waiting for a room to open because you can't reach the enemies with your knife. But, you know, the range also ties in my opinion, with the knife's biggest weakness, because you do have a limited range. Even if you make it to like 20 range, you're still not going to be able to fire across the entire room, like, for example, a Brimstone can. And for that reason, I think knife's biggest weakness is actually delirium. And I think this is a fairly overlooked one, right? Because it's kind of Azazel syndrome, if I want to call it that way, right? Azazel has an insanely strong early game, so newer players tend to really overestimate his strength, in my opinion, because Azazel has a problem with dying to end bosses a lot, because you're so forced to get close to them. It's just very, very easy to put yourself into a scenario where you just take way too much damage because you're too close to an enemy, and then it fires a Halo of Tears and you don't have time to react. That's basically Azazel's big problem, and Knife has that to an extent as well. Of course, you can throw the knife much further than Azazel's Brimstone reaches most of the time. So for bosses like Blue Baby, the Lamb, Mega Satan, that's not really a big deal, because you usually can still stay at the far end of the room. But then you take an enemy like Delirium, where I personally really appreciate having long range, because you can just stay in one corner of the room. Like, say there's a flurry of tears coming towards you, you just stay at the end of the room to try and dodge them, and you just fire blindly towards the center of the room and hope to hit Delirium. You pretty much can never do that with a knife, and because of the damage reduction on Delirium, there's also this problem where, you know, once you get the hits in, you do a lot a lot less damage to Delirium. So yeah, I think that's actually a really big problem. And is also the reason why I usually try to avoid Mom's Knife on Delirium runs. You know, it's not terrible, because one thing the knife does, it gets you to Delirium safely, right? If you do a knife run, you find an early knife, you try to go to Delirium, you can be pretty sure that you're gonna get there with 12 hearts. So that's obviously a really, really big advantage as well. But I mean, if you fought Delirium before, you know how quick those 12 hearts can disappear against him, especially if you don't have Polaroid proc. Now, if you have the Polaroid, of course, with the shield, the knife becomes insane against basically anything, because it means you're never going to take more than 1 heart of damage, basically in any given non-boss room. And even most bosses, you know, you're going to take damage, you're going to get that shield, and then you're just going to hug the boss to death if it doesn't have a damage shield. It's just going to get taken out, right? So pretty much anything that makes melee more viable, anything that protects you. Skill of Baphomet is another one. The trinket that gives you 2 seconds of invincibility every time you take on an enemy. Insane trinket with a knife. Virgo for the damage protection that it gives you sometimes when you get hit. The Celtic Cross, or Celtic Cross, however you want to look at it. Oh yeah, also if you find a second knife via Diplopia, or because you just like cheat engine the first one for the sake of a YouTube video. Yeah, if you find a second knife, suddenly it's basically like having 20/20 without the damage reduction. So that's pretty neat. But yeah, basically anything. And then if you have one sticking out of your butt as well, suddenly you have 3 knives. But yeah, basically anything that gives you damage shield is insane, both with the butt knife and the front throwable knife. You know, there's so much to do with it. It pairs well as well with the Cube of Meat. Also a very underrated one, because suddenly you have way more melee damage. It's much easier to just get up in someone's face trying to hug them to death, because suddenly the meat cube protects you to an extent, right? Common strategy to take out Blue Baby and Isaac boss fights is to just run around them in circles with the Cube of Meat facing them, so it blocks all the shots. Suddenly you have a lot more protection, a lot of the tiers are going to get blocked, and on top of that, the Cube of Meat also actually deals solid damage that stacks on top of the knife. So yeah, anything melee of course works with them, anything that protects you. Honorable mention of course still to anything that changes its color, even though I personally think those aren't that significant, of course, but I just like the knife changing color. Don't judge me for it. Oh, also probably worth mentioning, you're watching a Guppy run right now, and Mom's Knife does have a bit of an anti-synergy. It's not as bad as people make it out to be most of the time, but Mom's Knife produces significantly less flies with Guppy compared to you having a tier build, where it's a 50% chance for every tier that lands to produce a fly. And for Mom's Knife, I don't know what exactly the spawn rate is, but it's definitely significantly less tiers, because Mom's Knife ticks so often, they had to reduce the spawn rate for it massively, otherwise you just have way too many flies. But I mean, you can see we're still making a decent amount of flies, and we still have the Flight from Guppy, which is also a pretty good synergy as well, right? I mean, Flight is just nice in general, but Mom's Knife also has, you know, an implied spectral effect, because you can fire over rocks and everything. So the Flight is also really nice, because you can just throw your knife out while you're safely over a hole or a rock. Other than that, though, I mean, I get the people saying that if you like knife, you hate synergies. I don't, personally. Again, I already went into that, but there's really not too many other synergies that I can think of that are worth mentioning with the knife. There's C-section, but because both of those are quality 4 items, it's incredibly rare to get that synergy. But you're firing off those fetuses, fetuses, right? You fire off those fetuses that hold knives, which is incredibly fun and also pretty adorable. And there's the famous synergy, the infamous synergy even, with Forgotten, where your bone turns into a massive scythe that has the knife attached. Ultimately, that's really only, I think, a +4 damage up for Forgotten. Quote-unquote only. I mean, +4 is pretty massive. But it's still fun to run around with that big scythe. Other than that, I mean, there's a few items off the top of my head that synergize with it. I mean, stuff like Apple and Tough Love give it a chance to do a bit more damage each take, which is affected by luck. And Fruitcake effects still occur, but rarely do anything, because the knife just deals so much damage. You can still fire flames with Ghost Pepper, and Euthanasia and Little Horn can go off, but again, like, most of the things just die as soon as they touch the knife due to its massive amount of damage. So that doesn't really do too much. It's a very bland item in terms of synergies, but what I'm saying is it's very safe. So if you're looking to win consistently, if you're looking to build a streak, I very much recommend that you learn how to utilize the knife. If you don't like it, that is absolutely fine too. You're entitled to your opinion. You can play the game however you want. If you don't like Mom's knife, do not take it. I think that brings me to the end, to my first basement blather. Let me know what you think in the comments, and let me also know in the comments which items you want me to discuss next time. I would love to hear from you. I have a lot to say. I have so much time under my belt with this game. I can pretty much comment on every single game in the... I can pretty much comment on every single item in the game. I have a lot of things to say about them. So yeah, let me know what you want to hear about them. If you enjoyed this video, I'm trying to hit 2,500 subs before the end of the year. And as of the making of this video, I am 4 away from that goal. So if you watched it to the end and enjoyed it, I would really appreciate if you could show your support to the channel with a like and a subscription to the channel. As always, I hope you enjoy these. I do this challenge called Eden Destination Roulette regularly. If that's something that interests you, definitely make sure to subscribe and check out the videos that are linked in the comments. They're really interesting and they really showcase the power of the knife. Once again, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you're looking to win a lot of runs, I wish you many knives.